What is going on with all the drones over New Jersey? Is this just the continuation of a long-going problem with unidentified, unmanned aerial systems? Let's check it out. There was a very interesting Homeland Security Subcommittee hearing yesterday on Congress, and Senator Esposito here from New York kind of summed it up for us.
But first, I think it's important to quickly focus on stuff back at home. I mean, these drones over New York and New Jersey, flying over critical infrastructure, flying over some of, whether it's the Verrazano Bridge or others, I mean, I have to agree with my colleagues. The fact that we continue to say that we don't know what they are, we don't know what they're doing, I mean, the American people are looking at us and they think that we're lying to them because they think, how could you possibly not have answers to drones flying over some of the most critical airspace in the country? So, I mean, if we're expecting the American people to believe in the information that we're giving them, I think we do need to do better. And that's none of your fault. I mean, the fact that there's only a, $500,000 in drone expenditures appropriations, I mean, that's absolutely insane. And I hope that it's something that my colleagues work on. But
Mr. Jones represents the U.S. Border Patrol, Mr. Wheeler, the FBI, and Mr. Wiegman, the Department of Justice. And Mr. Wheeler testified that out of the $11 billion FBI budget, only about $500,000 has been spent on counter-UAS measures at the FBI. The FAA has been struggling with the regulation of drones and the ability to identify drones and keep up with this technology. 4 years ago, as widely reported here on the War Zone, in 2020, there was a large drone swarm in Colorado. Well, that remains largely unidentified as to who was operating those drones, but it did result in legislation and regulation by the FAA that now all drones over 250 grams are required to have a drone ID, identification system. But unlike ADS-B that we used on manned aircraft, drone IDs have very limited range. They use either Bluetooth or Wi-Fi connectivity in order to work, which gives them very limited range. It's not like you can pop open a Flight Radar 24 or some other sort of application and see all the drones that are flying in the area like we can with manned aircraft. Instead, with these apps, you're lucky if you're able to even find your drone and maybe one or two other drones that may be operating in very close proximity that you can connect to via Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. And in December of last year, as reported in the Wall Street Journal, a swarm of drones continued to monitor Langley Air Force Base for 17 days. And these drones often are well lit up at night and rather large, upwards of 6 feet in diameter, but yet authorities are unable to identify these drones as they're not using any form of remote ID. Now these drones in New Jersey are being reported here in Hunterdon County, which is very close to the Trump National Golf Club, and Picatinny Arsenal, located right up here. And apparently these drones have been flying right over the arsenal. Recreational drones are supposed to operate below 400 feet above the ground. Quick look at the airspace here where these sightings are being located. Much of this airspace is Class G up to 700 feet as marked by this magenta line. Over here in the blue is the Class B airspace of New York, which drones most certainly got to stay out of. And then we have the 30-mile ADS-B veil around the Class B airspace, but that applies to manned aircraft, that they must have an ADS-B operational transponder in order to operate in this area. But also inside this area are these two TFRs, temporary flight restriction areas, and this is the one over Picatinny Arsenal. Here under operating restrictions and requirements, no UAS unmanned aircraft systems operations are authorized in the area covered by this NOTAM except as described below. And here's the requirements that you need to meet in order to get permission to operate a drone in this area. And here UAS operators are warned that the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, or the Department of Defense may take security actions that result in the interference, disruption, seizure, damaging, or destruction of unmanned aircraft deemed to pose a credible safety or security threat to protected personnel. Counter UAS measures. Now, many of these drones being sighted appear to be operating at an altitude much higher than 400 feet, and this whole airspace regulation thing is a moot point because all of these drones are operating illegally because they're above 250 grams and they do not have any form of identification, or authorities would have been able to identify who is operating these drones at this time. And so far, all the military folks in the area are denying that they are the operators of these drones. So who is operating these drones? And so far, initial reports seem to indicate that these drones are operating after dark from about 5 p.m. till midnight and are often operating in what I would call a rather autonomous pattern, a pre-programmed pattern where they're simply doing a surveillance pattern over the area. So why is it so hard to simply take these drones down? Because it's a federal crime to shoot down any sort of an aircraft out of the sky. And besides, this jurisdiction pretty much right now lies in that of the FAA. It's the airspace, the FAA, that governs the airspace over the top of us. And it's very hard for local law enforcement authorities to get the required permissions in time to capture these drones before the drones leave the area. And right now, there are very few local law enforcement authorities that have the technology or the capability of safely taking these drones down using either jamming techniques or some sort of non-lethal, non-kinetic kinetic weaponry. In other words, just blasting it out of the sky with a shotgun, which would cause harm to folks on the ground and the falling objects and all of that. But very few local agencies have any sort of technology to safely get these aircraft out of the sky. Which brings us back to one of the salient points of this hearing here at Homeland Security. The current counter-UAS legislation is set to expire on December 20th of this year, just within a matter of a week or so. And this is the legislation that gives more local authorities and state authorities the ability to deal with these sort of threats. So if this unidentified drone surveillance is a threat to national security, Congress needs to get on with the program here and get the Counter-UAS Authority Security, Safety, and Reauthorization Act of 2024 moving through Congress. This is an extension and an improvement on the legislation that is about to expire here in about a week or so. And among other things, it would clarify and improve coordination requirements between Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and the Department of Transportation and the FAA, who regulates the skies above us. Increase public privacy and civil liberties protection, ensuring the information gathered by these CUAS systems are not misused and retained for extended periods of time. The big privacy issue is the fact that the remote IDs on these drones operate primarily off of your cell phone. So right now they can only capture the drone identification information off of the cell phone and nothing else out of the person's cell phone. Prohibit the DHS and DOJ from using or authorizing the use of counter-UAS systems that have been manufactured by certain foreign enterprises, i.e. China, where our DJI drones come from. Provide Homeland Security investigations to protect public airports. Direct the FAA to establish CUAS systems minimum performance requirements and provide the FAA with CUAS authority to ensure the safe and efficient operation of the national airspace system. The FAA is already pretty well strapped. They're going to be very hard pressed to keep up with these new requirements, and this is an excellent growth opportunity for any of you young folks out there getting into aerospace, coming up with counter UAS systems that work. Allow the Department of Homeland Security to protect critical infrastructure using counter-UAS measures, dams, power plants, that sort of thing. Allow the improvement of state law enforcement agencies the ability to use counter-UAS measures. Develop minimum training standards and programs for getting folks up to speed to operating these systems. And again, provide protection at airports. So who is operating these drones, and do they represent a credible threat to national security? And we've seen in Ukraine how incredibly effective the use of small, nearly homemade drone type devices have been in effective asymmetric warfare in the war in Ukraine. This is a big issue that's not going away anytime soon. There's a lot of opportunity here for young folks that are getting into aerospace to help solve this problem. Thank you so much for your support of this channel, especially the folks over on Patreon that make this content possible. See you here.